they often, even if they are asked, have they experienced an abusive experience, they might say no, not recognizing that what they've experienced actually is abusive because it's so normal.
I'm Susan Goss, and as a seasoned therapist of more than 15 years, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to gain so much wisdom from so many people and love passing that knowledge on to others. So join me and some of my favorite friends as we share some tangible truths with you. Hey guys, welcome back to the Tangible Truth Podcast. Wow, we've had a pretty heavy week 1 and week 2 of October. And so I've got which were phenomenal. And we're even going to touch on it, listeners, because I want some I'm going to do a little bit of clarification because we've had some questions. We've had wonderful feedback, by the way, but some questions too. So we're going to clarify that. But first, I want to introduce you to our guest. You are going to love her. It's Megan Taylor. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Susan.
I'm so excited to have you on the Tangible Truth Podcast. Listeners, you're going to love her, fall madly in love with Megan. She is a colleague. She is a friend. She is a phenomenal therapist, and she's done so much. She's done so many different things that actually I'm going to let her tell you about that and about her counseling center and what they do. I'm going to let you talk about gap relief. I just can't brag on Megan enough and her insight and her wisdom. And I'm so thrilled to have you on in the month of October, which, Megan, as you know, is National Awareness for Domestic Violence. And so we're going to be talking a lot about that, but you've had so much experience in that area. That's why I've invited you on. So, Megan, tell them what you're doing now and what you have done, where you've worked.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan. I'm glad to be here and glad to be joining you guys, especially this month as we look at National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's definitely something that matters a lot and has been really significant to me in the work that I have done over the course of several years. And so my background, kind of looking backwards, I've been a counselor in that realm for about 15 years. And the first several years of that, I spent at a children's advocacy center where primarily we were working with families where there was some sort of abuse, whether that was sexual abuse or domestic violence. And oftentimes those were co-occurring. And then there was a lot of emotional and verbal abuse occurring in those spaces as well. I have also worked in private practice settings in a couple of different spaces. And due to my work at the Advocacy Center, that kind of lent me to a space where I often was referred families and women specifically who had experienced domestic violence in various different ways. And so that's been a big part of what I've done in my counseling journey. And that has taken me to what I'm doing now and have been doing over the past couple of years. A friend and I started a nonprofit organization called Gap Relief. And the heart of our organization really is to help the helpers. And so our mission statement is help the helpers build resilient communities. And what we saw, a lot of this was influenced by my work at the Advocacy Center and with other nonprofits, is that those that are saying yes to really hard things and often working with people who've experienced trauma, as you do that work over time, there can be an impact that can lead to burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And so our goal really is to come up behind people that are working in sectors where they engage a lot of trauma and support the workers that are doing that hard work. And so we work a lot with local nonprofit leaders. We work a lot with law enforcement and first responders, educators, and then also do a good bit of work overseas internationally with those that are doing nonprofit and missions work overseas, which has also led us to working a lot with those that engage violence and trauma in various parts of the world as well. And so that's kind of our niche and our focus, and really, really am grateful for the work that I get to do. And it's definitely been informed by a lot of the experience that I had prior to that.
So, listeners, as I said, she's done so much. I'm so glad that you were able to verbalize all that. And I'm so grateful for you, Megan, and for that work that you are doing and for Gap Relief. I think that is a wonderful mission statement, wonderful vision statement. I know how much you travel.
We do.
You do.
Yeah.
You travel quite a bit, and it's so needed. So needed. So many times, just mission work, and missionaries feel isolated,
Oh,
alone,
absolutely.
and are not processing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so needed. But here, it's so needed as
Mm-hmm.
well. But I so appreciate your willingness to go and to
Mm-hmm.
serve that way.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you. So for this month, we're just going to jump right on in for what we are trying to really highlight this month, and that's domestic violence. And we have some stats. I know I asked you to put together
Mm-hmm.
some stats,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the listeners really need to hear it because so many times we just hear the term domestic violence. We just hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we know that it exists. Everyone does know that it exists, and we hate it.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not fully aware of how much it exists. Am I
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
And I see it in my office
Mm-hmm.
in many shapes and forms. You see it in your office and your center in many shapes and forms, but the general public does not really know as much as we know about the effects of it and who is affected by it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of the reasons I said, okay, I know who to call, Megan.
Mm.
So I don't know whether you want to start with children or adults, but listeners, we're going to cover stats in both
Mm-hmm.
because are we going to start with children?
We can start with children.
We're probably going to start with children, and then we're going to jump to adults because usually we end up with the family.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, the name of Children's Advocacy Center is now.
Yes.
You want to
Yes.
tell them
Here in
what-
Northwest Arkansas in Benton County is now the Children and Family Advocacy Center.
So we added family to that.
Yes.
So there you go. Okay. Stats.
Seeing that there's a lot of overlap. Yes.
Yes, a lot of overlap.
Yeah. And something that I'd like to share, around these statistics, even as we begin to share them, is that the majority of these statistics are self-reported. And so
Yes.
often I think what that means as we hear them is that the reality is that the numbers may actually be even higher than what we're hearing. I do think that there's been a trend in recent years where people have felt more comfortable to share, or where it feels like as the awareness increases, the reporting is increased as well, maybe for some things that have always been there, but people are beginning to share more. But I think it's possible that these numbers could be even higher.
Well, I believe I'll just jump in and say we know pretty much they are higher because we heard that, especially during COVID. We talked about that prior, that during COVID, so much was happening that, especially since we're going to start with children, they were afraid to report it.
Absolutely.
And so those we know a lot were not reported. But also, I would like to just add, back in the day, years ago, and we think, when I say the term back in the day, it wasn't too awful long ago that counseling itself was not like.
Oh, so true.
Yeah, it was just like, you go to counseling? Or
yes.
What? Counseling? I don't need to go to counseling or whatever. And now we're to 2024 where counseling that's not shunned on at all. It's like, great, my appointment's
it's much
at
more
1:30.
accepted or even championed.
Yeah. It's like my appointment's at 1:30 on Wednesday. It's like, I feel like everyone in the world should have a postcard. I always tell my clients that has your appointed time and day, because we all need it.
Yes, we do.
I go, you go.
Yes.
I mean, because I always tell my listeners, my sessions are only as healthy as I am.
Absolutely.
And I know you agree 100%. So that's not shunned anymore. So I think now it's starting to be reported more.
I agree.
But it's not shoved under the rug like it used to be.
I agree.
So these numbers are definitely not the real numbers, but it gives us an idea for those that have reported.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think that we are now beginning to see more and more possibly of what the reality is because, as you just shared, people are feeling more comfortable to engage in counseling relationships and to explore their stories. Because something that I've seen, and even specifically with children that I think impacts this as well, is that they often, even if they are asked, have they experienced an abusive experience, they might say no, not recognizing that what they've experienced actually is abusive because it's so normal. And it's become their norm and how things roll on a day-to-day basis. And so they may say no. And then as they get older or they enter into a counseling relationship or somebody that helps them reflect to see, oh, wait a second, that wasn't okay. Then we begin to hear different things from that. And so A couple of statistics connected to children specifically. And so if we're looking at domestic violence, around 10% in the United States of children experience domestic violence annually. And when I say that in regards to children, that means coming towards them specifically rather than witnessing. And so up to 36% of children may witness domestic violence of some kind over the course of a year. And that 36%, meaning they are in the home where domestic violence is occurring. Perhaps that's occurring between mom and dad, but that violence may not be coming directly towards them. However, of that 36% that is within a home that's experiencing domestic violence, about 60% of those children directly witness the domestic violence. So it's a fairly significant number.
That is a big number. 60%.
So 60% of children where there is domestic violence within the home are witnessing that domestic violence.
Okay. So secondary trauma.
So secondary trauma, they're visualizing it, they're seeing it.
Okay.
And then about 1 in 10 are experiencing that domestic violence themselves.
And when we're saying children are up to the age
of 18.
18. Megan, now when you were at the Child Advocacy Center, first response, would they go like when you had a child who, let's say, is 5 or 6, when they came to you, who was the first? Was it a counselor that they would see first? Or would it be like you that they would see first? Or would there be a team?
So I love that question. And something that I have been passionate about since I've been there. The model of children's advocacy centers are incredible. And so often at an advocacy center, when there is a report that's made, the child has a team that comes around them. The first person they interact with is often going to be a child advocate, and that person's job is kind of to connect with the family and to walk with them through the whole process. And then they would meet with a child-friendly forensic interviewer, and that's somebody who has been trained specifically to connect with children and to connect with them in their stories and what they've experienced, so that child may not have to meet with a uniformed officer to share their story.
Yes.
And then they're getting to share their story once.
So important.
So important.
Yes.
And so just creating a safer environment for those stories to come forward. And then the child would have the opportunity to connect with a counselor going forward from that place. And so in my time at the center, at one point I was the forensic interviewer, and so had been that frontline person that the child was disclosing their story to.
Okay.
And we were able to work that in a way where they were able to share that one time rather than having to repeat and share their story with multiple different people in the process.
I love that so much. And I'm so glad. I feel like I was sitting here when you were giving the stats. On my end, what I was doing is, God, what do you want me to ask? Because Jesus is he asked so many questions, and I had been praying what questions. But that's such a critical question because so many people don't want their child in particular to go through any kind of a process. Like, I don't want them to have to tell their story. I don't want them to have to
because
do that.
it might be more trauma.
It might be more trauma. But what you're saying is, no. We build an alliance with a child. They don't have to, because when a child sees a police officer, you know what they see? They see a gun. They see a uniform. They see this authority, and they say, they gasp.
Absolutely. And at times they've had experiences with officers that may not have been positive or.
That's right. They may even start crying, but with you, you're trained to know how to guide a child. When I say guide, I mean sit and patiently, because you and I both know the process of therapy is not easy. This is what I work with interns about all the time. They want to fix, immediately. It's like, no.
Yeah.
For us, you and I that are believers, it's trust God, trust the process. And that is not easy, especially the process of therapy. So you know how, because each child is different, to build that alliance, to work with the child so that they can share their story. And that is so important to hear, that it's not scary to take your child to the Child Advocacy and family.
Absolutely.
Thank you for so
Yeah.
that listeners can hear that.
Yeah.
Like, if I feel like, because during this month, we want people to hear, listen, if
Mm-hmm.
you know of someone that's being a child, right now we're talking about children, we will be talking about adults, a child that is in danger. And what does abuse mean to you, Megan?
That's a good question. Abuse really, I feel like, is an encompassing term where there is harm
Okay.
that is inflicted intentionally upon somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to answer that broadly, now when I look at what constitutes abuse or what constitutes domestic violence,
Mm-hmm.
I tend to look at that term a little broader than some may. I think traditionally, domestic violence often is referred to as physical violence of some kind, and I think that is the primary way in which it's understood. And so that may be, when you're thinking about children specifically, that might be like beating or hitting or bruising of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That often accompanies discipline, not always.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you look at intimate partner violence or violence between partners,
Mm-hmm.
that may look like physical violence of some type.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, when I think of abuse and underneath that umbrella of abuse, domestic violence, also include forms of sexual abuse there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Definitely.
oftentimes those two things coincide, whether that's with children or with adults. In fact, the numbers for sexual abuse with children are even higher, where
They
it's
are.
typically
Yes.
1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys before
Mm-hmm.
18. And so the physical violence and the sexual trauma don't always overlap, but they often do.
Mm-hmm.
I also would include verbal abuse or emotional abuse
Mm-hmm.
underneath that abuse umbrella as well.
Mm-hmm.
Really, anything where there is harm inflicted,
Mm-hmm.
there is some form of intention in that harm
Mm-hmm.
that is inflicted upon somebody else. Oftentimes, abuse is repetitive, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
There can be instances of, a single instance of abuse or a single occurrence of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But often, specifically with children and with partner violence, you're seeing that
Mm-hmm.
as something that is repetitive and becomes a pattern.
I 100% agree with that. And I appreciate what you said, because the 1 in 3 of the sexual abuse, I definitely include that and definitely put it under the umbrella of domestic violence, because in my experience with working with people, definitely the verbal abuse of, if you tell
Oh,
anyone
absolutely.
that I have done this,
Yes.
I will kill your mother and father. I will kill them if you say that, with that kind of with that tone of, I won't even use the tone I've heard in my office, but the threat to murder.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
the threat to kill your sibling, the threat to kill your family. So that, you're talking about a frozen, I know you're trauma expert, but I'm making up the term frozen trauma. The shadow, we're in the shadow world here now, and the child knows nothing to do. And they're certainly not going to talk. If you're going to kill my mom,
Absolutely.
if you're going to kill my dad, I'm not talking. If you're going to kill my sibling, I'm not talking.
Yes.
Because they're going to believe the abuser. It's so true about the domestic violence. I'm going to call it the domestic violence umbrella. Is that a fair statement?
I think so.
Because so many different things fall under that.
Absolutely.
Now, this would be, in my opinion, a natural break if you're willing to stay for like another episode, maybe a part 2 of this, to talk about adults.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's good that we're dividing up the child and then talk about the adult, and then we'll mesh the family. And then I told the listeners we're gonna clarify a few things from Susan's episode, which you've already listened to.
I have listened to. Wow, her story was incredible.
It is in miracle territory that she's alive, and that she loves Jesus, has gone through forgiveness and everything. And so grateful for the feedback. Listeners, thank you so much. And we want to clarify a few things. So we will jump back in part 2. And thank you, Megan. Thank you, listeners.
Yes, thank you all.
Come back next week. We love you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Tangible Truth Podcast, part of the KLRC Podcast Network.